There's something quietly strange about the Pokémon universe. On the surface, it looks soft and colorful, full of friendly creatures and cheerful music, designed to make you feel warm and comfortable. But the longer you sit with it, the more little cracks appear. A missing father here, a Pokédex entry that reads like a nightmare there. A town so musically unsettling that it started one of the most enduring urban legends in gaming history. The Pokemon universe has been hiding things for 30 years, and the fan community has been quietly cataloging all of it, building theories and connecting dots across games, anime, trading cards, and developer interviews, weaving together something that goes much deeper than a game about collecting creatures. So settle in, get comfortable. These are 100 Pokemon conspiracy theories, told slowly and carefully, one after another, meant to carry you somewhere calm and distant. There is no rush here, just the theories, and the quiet, and wherever your mind decides to drift. Section 1: The Origins of Everything. The very first theory worth sitting with is one that feels almost too simple to be remarkable, but once you see it, it becomes impossible to unsee. Before Pokemon was a game, before it had a name, before Satoshi Tajiri had anything more than an idea and a childhood love of bug collecting, the creature he first sketched onto paper was not Pikachu. It was not Bulbasaur. It was not even Mew, the mythical ancestor that the later games would treat as the origin of all life. The very first Pokemon ever drawn, according to records of the early design process, was Clefairy. Artist Ken Sugimori put pencil to paper and created this small, round, pink creature with stubby arms and a curl on its head. And for a while, Clefairy was going to be the mascot. The early manga adaptation of Pokemon, known as Pokemon Pocket Monsters, even depicted a Clefairy as the main protagonist's partner, not Pikachu. So what happened? The theory is not especially dark, but it is interesting. Pikachu tested better. When Game Freak ran early market research, they found that the little yellow mouse with lightning bolt ears appealed equally to young boys and young girls, while Clefairy skewed more heavily toward girls. The commercial decision was made. Pikachu became the face of Pokemon, and Clefairy was quietly demoted to a supporting character. And yet the traces remain. In the very first episode of the anime, Professor Oak's laboratory shelves are lined with Pokeballs. And if you look closely at certain frames, you can see a small pink shape among them. Whether intentional or coincidence, the story of Clefairy's near greatness lives in the background of the franchise's entire existence. The second theory, at the very foundation of Pokemon, concerns the number 151. In Pokemon Red and Blue, the Pokédex ends at Mew, number 151, and for years this felt definitive. But the internal coding of the original games tells a different story. Game Freak left placeholder data spread throughout the game, which is what eventually spawned the legendary glitch Pokemon known as Missing No. That entity was never meant to be encountered by players. It existed because the developers needed something to fill empty coding slots, to prevent the game from crashing when it tried to load data for a Pokemon entry that had no content. The theory here is that the original roster was meant to be much larger and was cut down significantly during the final stages of development, leaving these hollow spaces in the code. Some researchers who have dug into the game's data believe there were at least a dozen or more creatures that were cut entirely, their sprites deleted, their names erased, their coding stripped down until only placeholder shells remained. Missing No is not a glitch. It is a ghost of Pokemon that never made it to the world. The third theory concerns the Safari Zone, one of the most beloved and frustrating locations in Kanto. The idea of throwing bait and rocks at wild Pokemon instead of battling them was inspired, according to creator Satoshi Tajiri, by the feeling of observing animals in nature. He wanted players to feel the unpredictability of trying to catch something rare, something that might flee at any moment. But the theory goes further than inspiration. Some fans believe the Safari Zone was designed as a deliberate metaphor for Tajiri's own childhood. He grew up in a rapidly urbanizing area of Japan, and his beloved collection spots for insects were being torn away by construction and development. The theory is that the Safari Zone, with its rules and restrictions and limited opportunities to capture rare creatures, is a coded elegy for the natural spaces Tajiri lost as a child, and that the whole act of catching Pokemon was never really about a game at all. It was about a boy who wanted to preserve something fleeting and beautiful before the world erased it. The fourth theory is about Mew itself. According to the games, Mew is described as the ancestor of all Pokemon, a creature whose genetic code contains the DNA of every single species that exists. This makes Mew the biological origin point of an entire world. The theory extends this idea into something stranger, that Mew is not just an ancestor, but a conscious architect. The idea suggests that Mew's ability to use any move, learn any technical machine, and transform into any Pokemon is not a passive trait. It is an active one. Mew, in this reading, does not merely contain all other Pokemon within its genetic structure. It is actively generating new species, seeding the world with new life through a kind of biological imagination. Every time a new creature appears, somewhere in the deep wilderness of the Pokemon world, Mew created it. The Pokédex even alludes to this, describing Mew as extremely rare and almost never seen, which is consistent with a creature that operates entirely in secret, doing its work in the wilderness unseen and unobserved, endlessly producing new life. The fifth theory in this section touches on the nature of the Pokemon world itself. The games take place in a world that is clearly modeled on Japan, with Kanto mapping almost directly onto the real Kanto region, Johto resembling the Kansai area, and each subsequent region drawing from specific real-world locations. But the theory here is that this mapping is not just aesthetic, it is cosmological. The idea is that the Pokemon world is not a fantasy version of Earth, but rather an alternate Earth that diverged from our own at some specific point in history, and that the presence of Pokemon is not a magical addition to a realistic world, but the defining fact that caused history to unfold differently. In a world where a massive electric creature can level a city, military technology would develop completely differently. In a world where creatures with psychic abilities exist, human society would be restructured around them. The Pokemon universe is not Earth with monsters added to it. It is a world that was always going to produce something like human civilization, but which grew from a completely different root. The sixth theory concerns the Pokédex itself. In the original games, Professor Oak sends a 10-year-old child out in the wilderness specifically to gather data about Pokemon for the Pokédex. He gives the player a high-tech device that can identify any creature and store information about it. But the theory asks, if Oak has dedicated his entire life to studying Pokemon, and if Pokemon have lived alongside humans for generations, why would a brand new Pokédex still have so many blank entries? The answer some fans have proposed is that the Pokédex is not a pre-existing scientific database. It is a fresh one. And the reason it is fresh is that something happened, some catastrophic event or passage of time that erased the accumulated knowledge of generations. The Pokédex project is not routine scientific cataloging. It is a civilization trying to remember what it once knew and lost. The blank entries are not gaps in the data, they are scars. The seventh theory is smaller, but no less unsettling. It concerns the town of Pallet, where every Pokemon adventure in Kanto begins. The name Palette suggests a blank canvas, a starting point, and the town is depicted as tiny and sleepy, seemingly without much history. But the theory notes something curious. Directly to the south of Pallet Town, there is ocean. No routes, no other settlements, just open water. And while this is easily explained away as a map boundary, some fans have suggested that the ocean to the south represents something that has been removed from the map. That once there were towns and routes in that direction, and they are simply gone now. The ocean did not always reach to Pallet's doorstep. The theory does not specify what caused the land to vanish, but it connects to broader ideas about the Pokemon world's history. A history of erasure and forgetting that runs beneath the surface of every game in the series. The eighth theory wraps up this first section with a thought about the game's opening sequence. Before you name your character, before you choose your starter Pokemon, before the adventure begins, Professor Oak delivers a brief lecture. In the English translation of the original games, it begins with the famous line, "The world is inhabited by creatures called Pokémon." And the theory is simply this. The choice of the word inhabited is deeply strange if you think about it carefully. Inhabited suggests that humans came first and Pokemon arrived to share the space. But the game's own lore makes clear that Pokemon were here long before humans. So why say inhabited? One reading is that this was simply a localization choice, a casual word selected without deep consideration. Another reading, and the one that theories cluster around, is that the word was chosen deliberately, and that in the distant past of the Pokemon world, there was a time when humans and Pokemon lived apart, when the world was divided, and when the arrival of one species into the other's territory was a genuine historical event, not a comfortable coexistence that had always existed. If you are still with me, drop a comment letting me know where in the world you are watching from, what time it is, and what brought you here tonight. And if you are new to the channel, a subscription means the world. Every single one helps Unkokyuan Pokes keep the lights on and the theories flowing. Section 2. The Dark Lore Hiding in Plain Sight. There is a particular kind of darkness that Game Freak has been quietly embedding in the Pokédex for 30 years, does not announce itself. It sits inside 2 or 3 sentences of text, in small boxes that most players scroll past without stopping. But when you do stop, when you actually read those entries, some of them read less like naturalist observations and more like horror stories written for an audience that was too young to notice what they were reading. The ninth theory concerns Yamask, and it is one of the most emotionally disturbing pieces of writing in the entire franchise. Yamask is a ghost type introduced in Generation 5, and it looks like a small hovering spirit with a golden mask dangling from its tail. The Pokédex entry for Pokemon Black reads, "Each of them carries a mask that used to be its face when it was human. Sometimes they look at it and cry." 2 sentences. That is all it takes. And the theory that has grown around Yamask is not just that this creature was once a person, which the Pokédex states plainly, but that there are many of them. Not one cursed individual, but a species. Which means that whatever process transforms human beings into Yamask has happened many times, perhaps many times in every generation. And no one in the Pokemon world seems to find this particularly remarkable. You can catch a Yamask, you can put it in a box, you can use it in battles. The game will not comment on the fact that you are doing this to what is, according to its own description, a former human being. The 10th theory follows naturally from the 9th and concerns Gengar. The Pokédex describes Gengar as a creature that hides in shadows and steals warmth from its prey. A creature that slips into your shadow on dark nights and watches, waiting. But the theory goes further. For decades, fans have noticed that Gengar and Clefairy share an almost identical silhouette. They are the same Somaillas. They have the same general body shape, the same round ears, the same stubby limbs, the same proportions. The theory suggests that Gengar is literally Clefairy's shadow, given malevolent life. Not a separate creature, but the dark reflection of something gentle, the inevitable shadow cast by innocence. This idea is supported by the fact that both Gengar and Clefairy have strong connections to the moon in their Pokédex entries, with Clefairy described as dancing in the moonlight and Gengar described as being most active on nights of the full moon. They are two sides of the same coin, separated into different bodies, one reaching toward warmth and the other pulling warmth away. The 11th theory concerns Dreyfloon, the balloon-shaped ghost introduced in Generation 4, and it is one that tends to disturb parents more than children. The Pokédex entry reads that Dreyfloon tugs on the hands of small children to steal them away, and that it is whispered that any child who mistakes it for a balloon and holds on to it could wind up missing. In the Japanese text, the destination is described even more explicitly as the world of the dead. The theory built around Dreyfloon asks why such a creature exists. In the natural world, creatures evolve traits because those traits serve a survival function. What function does child abduction serve for Dreyfloon? One answer proposed by fans is that Dreyfloon is not a natural creature at all. It is the visible manifestation of a cultural tragedy, a creature born from the grief of children who died young, their spirits congealing into something that compulsively seeks to bring others to the same place. Every Drifloon is, in this reading, a lost child reaching back toward the world it left, which makes catching one feel considerably heavier than the game intends. The 12th theory concerns the orphaned creature known as Cubone, and it has been the subject of fan speculation since the first generation. Cubone wears the skull of its dead mother over its head. The Pokédex states that it cries on nights of the full moon because it sees the moon as an image of its mother, and the sound of its wailing echoes inside the skull. The existing theory about Cubone, the one that most fans know, proposes that Cubone is actually a baby Kangaskhan whose mother was killed, and whose skull it has placed on its own head. This is based on the physical similarities between the creatures, the fact that no Cubone egg has ever been shown hatching, and the notable lack of a baby Kangaskhan as a separate species until much later in the series. But there is a layer deeper than this. Early concept art for Cubone reportedly showed multiple skull designs for the creature, each belonging to a different species of mother, which means the original concept was not a single creature with a specific tragedy, but a template for grief. A creature that could carry the skull of any mother, any species, cementing the idea that the loneliness encoded in Cubone is not particular, but universal. The 13th theory is about Parasect, and it is one of the most quietly horrifying in the franchise. Parasect is a bug-type Pokémon that appears to be a crab with a giant mushroom growing on its back. But the theory, which is partly supported by the Pokédex itself, is that there is no Parasect. The mushroom took over its host long ago. The bug that walks underneath the fungus is not a living creature making choices. It is a hollow vehicle, its nervous system colonized entirely by the parasitic growth on its back. The Pokédex describes Parasect as having its host completely dominated by the mushroom, and fans have noted something deeply unsettling in its sprite. The eyes. Every other Pokémon has eyes that convey some kind of presence, alertness, or personality. Parasect's eyes are blank white, empty, because whatever was behind them is long gone. The theory extends this into territory that the games never visit. What did it feel like for the Paras to become Parasect? Was there a moment of awareness as the infection spread? Is there any residual consciousness still in there, trapped and watching from inside a body it no longer controls? The 14th theory circles back to the ghost type and concerns Haunter specifically. The Pokédex states that if Haunter licks you with its gaseous tongue, your body will shudder until death eventually comes. It also describes Haunter as hiding in dark corners, waiting to prank victims, which sits at a genuinely strange intersection of playful and lethal. The theory here is about the nature of ghost Pokemon as a category. Unlike other Pokemon types, ghost types are explicitly associated with death, possession, and the afterlife. But the games treat them as catchable, usable battle companions. The theory asks whether the act of capturing a ghost Pokemon is fundamentally different from capturing other types. Whether putting a Gengar or Haunter into a Pokeball is not training, but rather containment. And whether the Pokeball exerts some kind of suppression on creatures that might otherwise be genuinely dangerous. And if the ball is containing them, what happens when you release them? What does a ghost Pokemon carry away from decades of being inside a small sphere? The 15th theory involves the Marowak ghost in Pokemon Tower, and it is perhaps the most emotionally resonant moment in the entire first generation of games. Somewhere in the Tower of Graves, the player encounters a ghost that cannot be caught, cannot be fled from, and can only be driven away with a specific item. The game eventually reveals that this ghost is a Marowak, Kubone's mother, killed by Team Rocket. It is one of the rare moments in the original games where death is stated plainly, without euphemism. And the theory built around this moment is about what it means that you cannot catch her. Every Pokemon in the game can be captured except for this one. She exists outside the system. She is not a creature to be trained. She is a mother who died violently and whose spirit remained because she had not finished the work of loving her child. The player does not catch her. The player sets her free. This is, in the context of a children's game, a remarkable piece of storytelling. And the theory suggests it was not accidental that the developers deliberately placed this untouchable grieving mother in a tower full of graves to make a point about what grief looks like and what it takes to release it. The 16th theory concerns Mimikyu, a creature introduced in Generation 7 that conceals its true form beneath a hand-drawn Pikachu costume. The Pokédex states that a trainer once saw the true form beneath Mimikyu's disguise and went home and died painfully that same night. The theory around Mimikyu is less about the horror of that entry and more about the sadness underneath it. Mimikyu wears the Pikachu disguise because it wants to be loved. Because Pikachu is famous and beloved, and everyone wants to be near it. Mimikyu looked at the world and noticed that Pikachu got to be close to people, and it wanted that too. The tragedy is that whatever Mimikyu actually looks like is so terrible that looking at it kills you. The creature that most desperately desires affection is the one whose nature makes affection impossible. The theory proposes that Mimikyu's true form is not monstrous by choice, but by accident, that it never chose to be what it is, and that the Pikachu costume is not a disguise in the predatory sense, but in the lonely sense. The mask worn not to deceive, but to survive close to the warmth of human attention. The 17th theory concerns Honedge, the sword Pokemon introduced in Generation 6. The Pokédex states that Honedge came into being when a departed spirit inhabited an ancient sword, and that anyone who wraps their hand around its hilt will have their life energy slowly drained away. The theory here extends into the implications of where these swords come from. Honedge is found in areas near ruins and old castles, ancient swords, which means these were real weapons, used in real battles. And the spirits that now inhabit them are presumably the spirits of warriors who died by violence, attached to the instruments of their deaths. The theory asked what it would mean for a society to have these creatures walking around, and whether the people of the Pokemon world understand that when they encounter a Honedge, they are encountering someone who died a very long time ago and has been trapped in metal ever since. The 18th theory is about Banette, and it is one that quietly reframes how you think about childhood. Banette is a ghost type that looks like a possessed marionette, and the Pokédex states that it originated as a discarded stuffed toy that was thrown away and developed a grudge. It now wanders in search of the child who abandoned it. The theory built around this is less conspiratorial and more philosophical. If Banette is real within the Pokemon world, then the act of throwing away a beloved toy is a genuinely consequential act. A child's carelessness or cruelty, a single moment of deciding something old is no longer wanted, creates something dark and searching in the world. There is a moral embedded in this creature's existence that the game never vocalizes. The things we abandon do not simply cease to exist. They carry the shape of our indifference with them into whatever comes next. The 19th theory concerns the Pokédex entries for Spiritomb, a creature that was bound by a single curse into an odd keystone after committing 108 offenses. The nature of those offenses is never specified, and the theory here is that this is deliberate. The number 108 carries specific significance in Buddhist tradition, representing the 108 earthly temptations or desires that must be overcome on the path to enlightenment. The theory suggests that Spiritomb is not a random monster, but a deeply specific cultural artifact, a representation of the idea that unresolved desires and unconfessed sins accumulate until they form something dangerous and cohesive, something that then must be physically contained. The Pokemon world deals with this by sealing it into a stone, which raises the question of how many other places in the world contain similar sealed things, and what would happen if they were ever opened. The 20th theory closes this section with a thought about Kadabra. The Pokédex states that Kadabra was once a young boy who possessed psychic powers, and one day, when the boy awoke, he had become a Kadabra. The parents of this boy are never mentioned again. The theory has always been that there is an entire hidden history of human beings who were transformed into Pokémon, and that this transformation is not as rare as the games suggest. Yamask was human. Kadabra was human. Gengar is widely theorized to have once been human. The theory asks whether the boundary between human and Pokémon is not as stable as the world of the games implies, whether the categories are permeable in ways that nobody in that world openly discusses, and whether the Pokédex, in its clinical and matter-of-fact way, is quietly documenting an ongoing phenomenon that has no official name and no official response. Section 3, Ash's Dream That Never Ends. There is a theory about Ash Ketchum that first appeared in the early 2000s on internet forums and has never fully gone away, because unlike many fan theories, it does not require you to stretch very far to reach it. It simply requires you to look at the show with adult eyes and ask one honest question. Why does Ash never grow up? The 21st theory is the famous coma hypothesis, and it begins in the first 2 episodes of the series. In episode 2, a flock of angry Spearow chase Ash and his Pikachu across an open field. Pikachu, in a moment of genuine desperation, releases a massive electrical charge that lights up the sky and sends everything flying. Ash is struck. The camera cuts to a different scene, and when the show resumes, he is somehow upright and continuing his adventure. The theory states that he did not walk away from this. A 10-year-old human body, struck by an electrical blast powerful enough to blacken the sky and scatter dozens of birds, does not simply dust itself off. The theory says that Ash collapsed, that he was found, taken to a hospital, and placed on heavy medication while unconscious, and that everything that happens after that moment, every region, every rival, every legendary encounter, every victory and loss across 25-plus years of animation, takes place inside the mind of a boy who has never woken up. The 22nd theory builds out the coma hypothesis in ways that make it far more than a cheap trick ending. If Ash is in a coma, then the world he has constructed for himself is a wish fulfillment world, but one that his unconscious mind has constrained in very specific ways. He gets to be the hero. He gets to travel. He gets to be surrounded by friends who love him. But he is not allowed to win the big thing, not for a very long time. His mind will not let him become champion because becoming champion would mean the journey is over. And if the journey is over, there is no reason to keep dreaming. The coma is sustained by the adventure's incompleteness. Every near victory is the dream pulling back from the edge, refusing to let itself resolve, because resolution is a kind of death. The 23rd theory concerns the role of Team Rocket within this framework. Jesse and James and Meowth appear in almost every episode of the original series, and they follow a pattern so rigid it is almost ritualistic. They arrive, they have a scheme, they fail, they are blasted into the sky. They return, unchanged, the next episode. In the real world, no criminal organization operates like this. Real villains would learn, adapt, and eventually either succeed or give up. But coma theory proponents suggest that Team Rocket is not a criminal organization at all within Ash's dream. They are a psychological construct, a recurring obstacle that his sleeping mind has generated to represent something internal. The theory most commonly identifies them as the parts of Ash's own personality that he considers flawed or negative, given external form so he can confront them repeatedly without having to acknowledge they are his. They keep coming back because the internal conflict they represent is never fully resolved. They are not villains, they are mirrors. The 24th theory concerns Ash's companions and what each of them represents in the coma framework. Misty, in the most detailed versions of this theory, is identified as Ash's first love, an image he had formed before the accident of a girl he found interesting, made into a constant presence by his sleeping mind. Brock represents Ash's more mature impulses, the side of him that understands responsibility, the side that wants to take care of things. The theory points to how Brock is always the one who cooks and organizes and mothers the group, the function that a father figure would serve in a healthy family, performed instead by a teenage friend. The professors and Nurse Joys and Officer Jennies, who appear identically in every region, are the stability elements of the dream, the familiar faces that tell Ash's unconscious mind that no matter how far he travels, the world is safe and consistent, even if it is not real. The 25th theory addresses the question that most directly challenges the coma hypothesis. If this is a wish fulfillment dream, why doesn't Ash win more easily? Why does his coma mind torment him with failure? The answer proposed is that Ash's coma is a healing process, not a reward. His brain is not giving him what he wants. It is giving him what he needs. He needs to learn that losing is survivable. He needs to learn that friendship is real even when it is painful. He needs to learn that the journey has value even when the destination is not reached. The losses are medicine. The rivalries are medicine. Even the most heartbreaking goodbyes, releasing Butterfree, saying goodbye to Brock, watching companions leave, are medicine. His dreaming mind is preparing him very slowly for the moment when it will finally be safe to wake up. And the theory posits that when Ash finally became world champion in the later series, that was the signal. The therapy was complete. The healing was done. Not long after, the character's story ended, and in some quiet way, that reads less like a narrative conclusion and more like a door opening. The 26th theory is about Ho-Oh, the legendary bird that Ash glimpses at the end of the very first episode, before the accident, before everything that follows. He sees a golden bird catching the light of the sun, and the sight of it fills him with awe. Ho-Oh, in the lore of the Pokémon games, has the ability to resurrect the dead and grant eternal happiness to those it meets. The coma theory's most poetic interpretation suggests that the Ho-Oh Ash saw in that first episode was not a random sighting. It was a promise. Something vast and ancient looked down at a small boy in the grass and decided to give him the most extraordinary gift it could offer, a dream worth living in, for as long as he needed it. Ho-Oh did not save Ash's life in the medical sense. It created the conditions for something better than survival. It gave him a world to inhabit while his body waited for him to be ready. The 27th theory is a smaller extension of the coma framework and concerns the recurring motif of Ash nearly aging. Multiple times across the series, characters age around him slightly. Storylines develop and conclude. Years seem to pass within the world's events, and yet Ash remains 10. The theory notes that in a dream, time does not pass at a normal rate. A single night of sleep can contain what feels like years, and a coma, which occupies a different state of consciousness entirely, might compress or expand time in ways that create this exact effect, where everyone in the dream is subject to the soft rules of time passing, except for the dreamer himself. Ash does not age because the dreamer does not age in their own dream. He is always exactly as old as he was when he fell. The 28th theory within this section concerns the famous scene in the first Pokémon film where Ash is turned to stone and then restored by the tears of Pokémon. Within the show, this is presented as a magical event, an act of collective grief powerful enough to reverse death. But the coma theory proposes a different reading. In this reading, the petrification of Ash is the dream representing the coma itself. He becomes still. He becomes silent. He becomes a body that his companions weep over. And the restoration is not magic. It is the medications working, the treatment taking hold. The crisis moment in the dream is a direct representation of what is happening to his body in the hospital, translated into the language of the world his mind has created. Ash dies and is restored in the movie because the boy in the hospital bed came very close to something irreversible and then was pulled back. Section 4. The shadows behind Team Rocket. Team Rocket functions in the Pokémon universe the way that certain recurring elements always function in stories told to children, as a reliable source of obstacle, comedy, and occasional genuine threat. But beneath the performance of incompetence, beneath the theatrical motto and the dramatic poses and the inevitable defeat, there is a layer of backstory that the anime only occasionally allows to surface. And when it does, it tends to be darker and stranger than anything the main plot contains. The 29th theory is about Giovanni and is one of the most structurally satisfying in the entire franchise. The theory states that Giovanni is Ash's father. This is unconfirmed, has been largely contradicted by official sources, and was explicitly ruled out by the stage musical Pokémon Live, which established that Giovanni and Ash's mother Delia dated but that Ash's father was a separate person entirely. And yet the theory persists because the circumstantial architecture of it is genuinely compelling. Ash has no father. Giovanni is the most powerful man in Kanto. Jesse and James, two bumbling adults who should be more than capable of defeating a 10-year-old child, somehow fail to do so in literally hundreds of encounters. The theory says this is not incompetence, it is instruction. Giovanni sent the most harmless members of his organization to follow Ash, knowing they would fail, because following Ash was never about capturing Pikachu. It was about making sure Ash was safe, challenged, and growing from a distance, in the way that a man who has chosen a criminal life might try to parent a child he cannot openly claim. The 30th theory concerns the backstory of Meowth, and it is one of the saddest stories in the entire anime, told in fragments across a handful of episodes. Meowth, unlike other Pokémon, can speak human language. He learned to do it by watching humans because he wanted to be close to a human girl named Meowsy. He taught himself to walk upright, taught himself to talk, and went to her expecting to be loved for the extraordinary effort he had made. She rejected him, calling him creepy and unnatural. The theory built around this story concerns what it cost Meowth to become what he is. To learn human speech, he had to give up the ability to use the standard moves that other Meowth use in battle. He became less of a Pokemon in exchange for becoming more of a person, and was rejected by the person he became at 4. He then joined Team Rocket, and the theory suggests that his loyalty to that group, particularly to Giovanni, is a substitute for the belonging he lost the moment Meowsy turned him away. He is not a villain. He is a creature that wanted to be loved and paid an enormous price for the wanting. The 31st theory concerns Jessie's history, and the anime reveals pieces of it slowly and reluctantly across many episodes. She grew up in severe poverty. Her mother, Miyamoto, was a Team Rocket operative who disappeared on a mission and was never found. Jessie was raised essentially alone, sometimes eating snow because there was nothing else. The theory builds from here into territory the show never explicitly explores. That Jessie's obsession with wealth, her desperate performances of confidence and glamour, her rage when things go wrong are all responses to a childhood that gave her nothing stable to stand on. The theory suggests that Jessie did not become Team Rocket's most dedicated failures because she is stupid or unlucky. She became one because Team Rocket is the only family she has ever had that stayed, and on some level, she does not want to succeed enough to leave it. The 32nd theory concerns James and his extraordinary wealth. It is established in multiple episodes that James comes from a spectacularly rich family, with estates and servants and parents who tried to arrange his marriage from childhood. He ran away. He joined Team Rocket. He chose poverty and failure over privilege and comfort. The theory asks why. And the most developed answer is that James's wealthy family was emotionally suffocating in a way that poverty is not. His parents controlled everything. His engagement to Jessie Bell, a woman who was essentially a domineering version of everything he feared, represented a future of managed expectations and no authentic self. Team Rocket gave him something his family never did: the freedom to be genuinely ridiculous. The freedom to care about things, his Pokemon especially, without being told that the caring was inappropriate or excessive. James chose failure over a certain kind of success because failure, in his life, came with love attached to it. The 33rd theory concerns the relationship between Jessie, James, and Meowth as a trio, and what the structure of their partnership actually represents. The theory proposes that the three of them are not colleagues or even friends in the conventional sense. They are a family unit, the only functional one any of them has ever had. Jessie is the fiery, driven parent who never had stability. James is the gentle, sensitive parent who ran away from his own suffocating family. Meowth is the child who taught himself to talk and walk upright so he could be close to people, and who now is permanently close to these two people, no matter how many times they are sent blasting into the sky. They return to each other because they have nowhere else to go, and because the thing they have built together, chaotic and ridiculous and often painful as it is the closest any of them has ever come to home. The 34th theory concerns Giovanni's Persian, the sleek cat that the Team Rocket boss strokes while issuing commands. Giovanni almost never uses this Persian in battle. He has powerful Pokemon available to him. He won the Earth Badge Gym, which means he was once a legitimately skilled trainer. But he chooses to sit with this one quiet creature instead. The theory suggests that Persian represents Giovanni's only genuine emotional attachment, the one relationship in his life that asks nothing of him, that carries no schemes, that simply sits and allows itself to be near him. Giovanni is a man surrounded by subordinates who fear him, enemies who challenge him, and an organization built on exploitation. Persian is the one creature he did not recruit, did not manipulate, and does not command. It simply chose to stay near him, and he chose to let it. The 35th theory is about Team Rocket's motto, and specifically about the way it changes between countries. In the original Japanese version, the motto is more poetic than the English one, with references to love, honor, and wordplay that give the characters a kind of theatrical dignity. The English version is more comedic and memorable, is more. The theory is that this localization shift was deliberate and that it fundamentally changed how Western audiences perceived Team Rocket. In the Japanese version, they read as a tragic comedy duo, aware of their own absurdity but performing it with genuine passion. In the English version, they read as bumbling clowns. This reframing has consequences. If you see Jesse and James as tragic figures doing their best with broken tools, the show becomes something different. If you see them as incompetent jokes, it becomes something easier and lighter. The theory proposes that the English localization deliberately chose the lighter reading because a truly tragic Team Rocket would have been too heavy for the demographic, and that in doing so, it created a version of these characters that the fandom has spent decades slowly excavating to find the tragedy underneath. The 36th theory concerns the brief moments in the anime where Team Rocket steps outside their antagonist role entirely. There are episodes where they help Ash. There are moments where Meowth translates a Pokemon's feelings and the translation is genuinely moving. There is the famous final scene of the episode where Ash says goodbye to Butterfree, where the camera holds on Jesse and James watching from a distance, and they do not scheme or steal. They simply watch. And they look sad. The theory is that these moments are not anomalies in the characterization, but the truth of it, that the default antagonist state is a performance. And these brief drops of the mask show who the characters actually are underneath. They are people who, like Ash, are having the journey of their lives, and who feel things deeply even when the plot requires them to pretend otherwise. The 37th theory concerns Archer and Petrel and the other unnamed leaders of Team Rocket's executive tier, and it involves the 3 years that pass between Red and Blue and Gold and Silver. During those years, Team Rocket attempted to reconvene. They broadcast radio signals from Mahogany Town. They took over the Goldenrod radio tower. They were clearly waiting for something or someone. The theory proposes that the executive members of Team Rocket were waiting for Giovanni to return because they genuinely did not know what to do without him. Not out of obedience, but out of grief. The theory frames them not as loyal lieutenants biding their time, but as a group of people who had built their lives around a man who disappeared, and who filled the space his absence left with increasingly desperate acts, trying to summon him back by doing the kinds of things he would have done, hoping he would hear about it and come home. Section 5. The War That Shaped Everything. There is a line of dialogue in Pokémon Red and Blue that sits in the middle of a gym battle and has never been explained in any fully satisfying way by official sources. It comes from Lieutenant, from Surge, the gym leader of Vermilion City. Before the battle, he tells the player, "Electric Pokémon saved me during the war." He does not say which war. He does not say when it was fought, or who fought it, or what was at stake. He says it as though it is common knowledge. And then he moves on, and the game moves on, and for decades the fandom has been pulling at that thread. The 38th theory is the Great Pokémon War hypothesis, and its basic structure is this. At some point before the events of Red and Blue, a large-scale military conflict took place in the Kanto region. This conflict was devastating, and it was fought with Pokémon used as weapons. The evidence for it is scattered throughout the game in ways that feel too consistent to be accidental. The most obvious piece is Lieutenant Surge himself, who is built like a soldier, dressed like a soldier, and carries himself with the disciplined wariness of someone who has seen something that cannot be unseen. His name is a military rank. He is the only gym leader in the game whose title is a rank rather than a name. The game's Fame Checker, added in the Fire Red and Leaf Green remakes, notes that Surge was known in the army for his caution, which is how he survived when others did not. The 39th theory follows from the war hypothesis and concerns the demographics of Kanto. Walk through the game and count the middle-aged men. There are almost none. The adults you encounter are elderly, or they are gym leaders, or they are Team Rocket members. The police force is entirely female. The medical staff is entirely female. The children travel alone because there are no fathers at home to stop them. The theory states that this is because the adult male population of Kanto was decimated by the war. The fathers are not absent because of some casual storytelling choice. They are absent because they died. Red has no father mentioned. Blue's parents are both gone, and he is being raised by Professor Oak. The lack of men in the game's world is not a design oversight, but the fingerprint of a catastrophe. The 40th theory adds a geographic dimension to the war hypothesis by asking who Kanto fought. The most compelling candidate, and the one that Lieutenant Surge's dialogue most directly supports, is that the war was not between Kanto and Johto, but between an analog of Japan and an analog of the United States. The Pokémon world's closest equivalent to America is Unova, the region based on New York. Surge himself speaks in a way that suggests a different cultural origin from the Kanto locals. And tournament dialogue in Generation 5 identifies him as potentially Unovan. The theory draws a deliberate parallel between this fictional war and the real Second World War, noting that Kanto is modeled on Japan and Unova on America, and that a war between them would explain not only the demographic devastation, but the particular emotional texture of the first generation of games, a world rebuilding itself slowly, trying to remember who it was. The 41st theory concerns the underground tunnel systems that connect various cities in Kanto. In the games, these tunnels are explained as routes for trading and transit, but the theory proposes that they were originally built as infrastructure during the war, specifically as bomb shelters and military corridors. The absence of entertainment venues in Kanto, no cinemas, no theaters, no public gathering spaces, is explained by the theory as the legacy of a society that spent years in survival mode and never fully rebuilt its cultural institutions. The theory notes that the Pokemon centers and gyms exist in abundance because those were militarily useful structures, but the spaces associated with leisure and peace are almost entirely absent. The 42nd theory concerns the ghost in Pokemon Tower and the Marowak who died there and connects this directly to the war. The theory proposes that the Marowak was not simply killed by Team Rocket in some petty theft gone wrong. She was a veteran, or the mate of a veteran, and her death resonates with the broader context of what Team Rocket represents in a post-war Kanto. Team Rocket is what happens when a society's men come back from war traumatized and unemployable, when the institutions that might have supported them have been destroyed, and when crime fills the vacuum that legitimacy has left behind. The men of Team Rocket are not simply greedy, they are broken, and the structure of their organization gives them the only kind of hierarchy and purpose they understand anymore. The 43rd theory concerns Kubone's mother specifically and why her ghost was so powerful. The theory suggests that Marowak's spirit was unusually potent, not simply because she was a mother, but because she was a warrior who had survived things that should have killed her, and the specific violence of her death at the hands of Team Rocket activated something in her that simple grief would not have. She could not pass on because she did not die at the end of something. She died in the middle of protecting someone, and that unfinished state kept her anchored to the world. The theory further proposes that the sylph scope the player uses to identify the ghost was developed specifically in response to post-war spiritual disturbances, that the war killed so many people and Pokémon that the proliferation of restless ghosts became a documented and studied phenomenon, and that the equipment used to handle them was a direct product of that research. The 44th theory concerns the Pokémon Tower itself, and specifically its evolution across the games. In Gold and Silver, the tower is transformed. The graves are still there at the base, but the top floors have been converted into a radio tower, broadcasting music and signals across the region. The theory sees this transformation as a metaphor for how societies handle mass death. You do not remove the graves. You build on top of them. You make the place of mourning into something functional, something forward-looking, something that transmits sound into the future instead of holding silence for the past. It is an act of very specific cultural grief management, and the theory proposes it was conscious, that the developers of Gold and Silver were drawing a parallel between the transformation of Pokémon Tower and the way Japan itself transformed its most painful historical sites after the Second World War. The 45th theory closes this section by noting something that the games never addressed directly. No one in Kanto talks about the war. Not the elderly characters who would have been adults during it. Not the gym leaders who survived it. Not the professors who presumably knew people who died. The theory proposes that the silence is not an oversight or a simplification. It is the most accurate thing the games do. Societies that survive catastrophic wars frequently develop a collective inability to speak about what happened, a cultural aphasia around the most significant events in their recent history. The silence in Kanto is not empty. It is the shape of something too large to hold an ordinary conversation, a wound so wide that the only way to live around it is to stop describing it entirely. Section 6. The Sound Beneath Lavender Town. In the spring of 1996, Pokémon Red and Green were released in Japan. Within weeks of the release, the games were in the hands of millions of children. And one area of those games, a small, desolate town in the east of Kanto built around a tower of Pokémon graves, had music so strange and unsettling that it would eventually become the foundation of one of gaming's most enduring urban legends. The 46th theory is the Lavender Town Syndrome hypothesis, and it must be addressed honestly before it is addressed atmospherically. It is, in its most extreme form, a fabrication. There is no documented evidence that children died as a result of the Lavender Town music in 1996. The rumored death toll of approximately 200 suicides has no basis in any verified historical record. The story, which emerged primarily on internet forums in the early 2000s, was a creepypasta, a piece of collaborative horror fiction built on a genuine foundation of unease and amplified through the natural amplification machinery of online communities. This needs to be stated clearly because the legend has a way of blurring into plausibility. The 47th theory concerns what is actually true in the Lavender Town legend. And something is actually true. The music for Lavender Town in the original Japanese version of Pokémon Red and Green was changed before the international release. The original track contained high-frequency tones that the Game Boy speaker rendered in a way that many players described as genuinely unpleasant, particularly at higher volumes. Whether these frequencies were binaural beats specifically designed to affect the brain, as the legend claims, is unverified and almost certainly false. But the change is real. Something in the original track was softened for Western audiences, and in the complete absence of any official explanation for exactly what was changed and why, the gap filled itself with something much darker. The 48th theory concerns the location of Lavender Town within the geography of Kanto. It sits to the east, separated from the main progression of the game, accessible only through a narrow route. It is not on any direct path to anything the player needs. You go there because the story sends you there, and the story sends you there specifically to deal with death. The Pokemon Tower is the game's cemetery. Lavender Town is the game's lesson about loss. And the theory about the town's placement is that its isolation was deliberate, that the developers understood they were making children confront grief, and wanted to give that confrontation its own physical space, apart from the rest of the world, accessible only through a specific act of intention. The 49th theory concerns the ghost that was found in early data for Pokemon Red and Blue but was removed from the final game, known by fans as Buried Alive. In the original design of Pokemon Tower, there was reportedly an encounter at the very top floor with a skeletal figure that had been partially buried, and which would serve as the dungeon's final boss. The encounter was removed before release and replaced with Mr. Fuji, the kindly old man who the player rescues. The theory about Buried Alive is not simply that it was cut for being too dark, but that it was cut because the original design of Pokemon Tower was substantially grimmer than what was released, and that the change from a genuine horror encounter at the top of a tower of graves to a rescue of a peaceful old man was a deliberate softening of something that was meant to be genuinely traumatic. The question the theory leaves hanging is this: if Buried Alive was too dark for the final game, what does that say about how dark the original vision was? The 50th theory concerns the music itself. The Lavender Town theme is composed in a way that is genuinely unusual for a children's game. It uses a minor key, obviously, but the specific intervals it employs, the specific relationship between its tones, creates a dissonance that sits in the ear differently from most game music of its era. The composer, Junichi Masuda, has spoken about the music of the early games in general terms, but never specifically about what he was trying to achieve with Lavender Town. The theory among music analysts in the fandom is that he was trying to represent the state of being between two worlds, the liminal space between life and death that the tower represents, and that the dissonance in the music is intentional and precise, calibrated to make you feel like you are standing in a doorway rather than a room. The 51st theory is about what Lavender Town's transformation in gold and silver means for the fandom's relationship to it. In the sequel games, the Tower of Graves is still there, but it has been rebuilt above, and the upper floors have become a radio station. Players who know the original games feel a specific kind of unease visiting the rebuilt location because they know what is underneath the cheerful broadcasting equipment. The theory proposes that this layering was the developers commenting on something real about how societies handle death and grief. That the transformation of a sacred space into a functional one is not disrespect, but survival, and that the ghosts still in the lower floors are not disturbed by the signals being sent from above. They are perhaps comforted by them. Section 7. The Clone, the Ancestor, and the Shapeshifter. The cloning experiments conducted on Cinnabar Island are one of the most explicitly dark pieces of official canon in the original Pokemon games. Journal entries in the burned ruins of the Pokemon Mansion describe researchers capturing a rare creature called Mew in the jungles of Guyana, extracting its genetic material and using it to engineer something new. The result was Mewtwo, the most powerful Pokemon ever engineered, a creature of massive intelligence and absolute rage at its own existence. But the theory that has circulated around the Cinnabar experiments for decades is not primarily about Mewtwo. It is about what else the scientists made. The 52nd theory is the Ditto hypothesis, and it is one of the most structurally elegant theories in the franchise. The argument begins with the observable facts. Ditto and Mew are the only two Pokemon capable of using the move Transform. They share an almost identical weight at 8.8 pounds each. Their base stats, while vastly different in total, are distributed with the same perfect balance across all categories, suggesting the same underlying design philosophy. Their shiny forms are the same shade of light blue, and in the original games, Ditto appears in the wild specifically in two locations: the Pokemon Mansion on Cinnabar Island, where the journals document Mewtwo's creation, and Cerulean Cave, where Mewtwo eventually takes up residence after escaping. The theory states that Ditto is a failed Mew clone, one of many attempts that produced a creature that could transform, but could not specialize, that could become anything, but could not be anything definitively itself. Mewtwo was the successful product of those experiments. Ditto was the discarded prototype. The 53rd theory concerns the implications of the Ditto hypothesis for the Pokemon world's biological understanding. If Ditto is a failed Mew clone, then the ability to breed with almost any species that Ditto possesses in the game mechanics is not a quirk but a consequence. Mew contains the genetic code of every Pokemon species. A failed clone of Mew would retain enough of that material to be biologically compatible with almost anything, without being a perfect copy of any of it. Ditto's universal compatibility is the echo of Mew's universal containment, distorted by imperfect science and reproducing itself endlessly in the wild. Generation after generation of creatures that are simultaneously everything and nothing, capable of being any shape but never quite at home in their own. The 54th theory expands on this and concerns the emotional state of Ditto specifically. Ditto has no emotions attributed to it in the Pokédex. It exists. It transforms. It breeds. It does not, as far as the official text is concerned, feel anything. The theory proposes that this blankness is the most heartbreaking thing about it, that a creature designed to be everything cannot find what it itself is, that the shape-shifting ability that makes it so useful in the game's mechanics is the external expression of an identity that was never successfully formed. Mewtwo, for all its rage, knows what it is. It is angry about it, but it knows. Ditto has never had that certainty. It is a creature made of other creatures' shapes, endlessly borrowing and returning faces, spending its entire existence wearing masks because no one made it a face to wear. The 55th theory is about Mewtwo directly, and concerns the moment in the first Pokémon film when Mewtwo creates its own army of cloned Pokémon and attempts to use them to wipe out the originals. What the theory dwells on is not the action but the logic. Mewtwo understands, specifically from its own existence, what it is to be created without consent, to be brought into the world for someone else's purpose, to have your existence be fundamentally instrumentalized from the beginning. And its response to this is to do the exact same thing to other creatures, to make clones, to tell those clones that they are superior, to build a hierarchy based on the same principles of manufacturing and ownership that were used against it. The theory reads Mewtwo not as a villain, but as a trauma response that has scaled to catastrophic size. A creature so deeply shaped by what was done to it that it can only conceive of the world in terms of ownership and control. The 56th theory concerns what Mew itself represents, and why it was placed in the jungle of Guyana in the game's internal mythology. Guyana is a real place, and it was specifically chosen. The theory notes that Guyana sits in one of the most biodiverse regions on Earth, the Amazon basin's northeastern edge, a place where new species were and continue to be discovered with some regularity. The choice to place the ancestor of all Pokémon in this specific real-world location was not arbitrary. The theory reads it as the game's quiet acknowledgement that the mystery at the center of all life is not somewhere remote and constructed, but somewhere real, somewhere lush and full of things that science has not yet named, somewhere that contains its own muse if only we knew how to look. The 57th theory is about the Pokémon Mansion journals and what they actually say versus what the fandom remembers them saying. The journals document a creature discovered in Guyana, the capture of Mew, and the development of Mewtwo. But the specific wording is remarkably clinical and then, near the end, becomes something else entirely. The final entries describe Mewtwo growing more powerful day by day, show the scientists becoming increasingly aware that what they have made has exceeded their ability to contain, and end abruptly. The theory reads these journal entries not as simple exposition, but as the game's most direct statement about the ethics of the Pokemon world. That the application of scientific knowledge without moral framework produces things that cannot be undone, and that the burned ruins of the mansion are not a tragedy, but a consequence. Section 8. The God at the beginning of time. In Generation 4, the games of the Diamond and Pearl era introduced something that felt different from everything that had come before. Previous games had legendary Pokemon that were powerful and rare. Generation 4 introduced Pokemon that were not simply powerful or rare but cosmological, creatures whose existence define the structure of reality itself. The 58th theory is about Arceus and what its existence implies about the nature of faith in the Pokemon world. According to the game's mythology, Arceus hatched from an egg in the void before the universe existed, and with its 1,000 arms, which take the form of the rings of light around its body, it shook the universe into being. It then created Dialga to govern time, Palkia to govern space, and Giratina to govern the space between, the reverse world that lies beneath and behind everything that exists. And then Arceus went to sleep. The theory built around this is not complicated, but it is profound. In the Pokemon universe, God is real, provably real, and capturable in a Pokeball. This is not metaphorical. Players can encounter Arceus. They can engage it in battle. They can throw a ball at it and put it in a computer box. The theory asks what this does to the concept of worship in the Pokemon world. If the deity is not only real but obtainable, and whether the people of that world relate to Arceus the way they might relate to a particularly impressive Pokemon, or whether there is something else entirely, some kind of reverence that the games acknowledge but never fully explore. The 59th theory concerns Giratina specifically, and it is perhaps the most theologically rich theory in this entire list. Arceus created Giratina alongside Dialga and Palkia. But where Dialga and Palkia govern dimensions that are continuous with the living world, Giratina governs antimatter, the distortion world, the reverse of reality, and Arceus banished it there because Giratina was violent. The theory draws a direct parallel between Giratina and the concept of the fallen angel in religious traditions, a being of great power and cosmic significance that was created by God and then cast out not for weakness but for excess. Giratina was not banished because it was insufficient. It was banished because it was too much. Its gravitational forces were incompatible with a world designed for life. It had to go somewhere that nothing else lived, because its very nature disrupted the conditions that made living things possible. The theory reads Giratina not as evil, but as the part of reality that could not be integrated, the necessary shadow of a universe that chose matter over antimatter, the exile who holds in place the balance that makes the living world stable. The 60th theory concerns the three lake guardians, Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf, and their role in the creation mythology. According to the game's lore, Arceus created these three beings to govern knowledge, emotion, and willpower respectively, and set one in each of the three great lakes of Sinnoh. The theory built around them concerns why these three qualities were singled out for divine stewardship. Knowledge, emotion, and willpower are not random concepts. They are the three components that, in most psychological and philosophical traditions, make up the full capacity of a self-aware mind. Arceus did not just create the universe's physical structure. It created the conditions for consciousness. The Lake Guardians are not just spiritual entities, they are the foundations of every mind that has ever existed in the Pokemon universe. The forces that make thought, feeling, and agency possible. And they have been sleeping in lakes for millennia. The 61st theory concerns Dialga and Palkia and what the nature of their domains implies about the history of the Pokemon world. Dialga controls time. Palkia controls space. In the games, both are worshipped in Sinnoh, with different communities orienting their reverence toward one or the other. But the theory built around this is about what happens at the intersection. If time and space are governed by separate beings, what happens when those beings come into conflict as they do in the film Pokémon, The Rise of Darkrai? The theory suggests that the conflicts between Dialga and Palkia are not simply battles between powerful Pokémon, but rather catastrophic breakdowns in the stability of reality itself. That when these two beings fight, the laws of physics in their immediate vicinity become locally suspended, and that the collateral damage of their conflicts is not simply environmental destruction, but something closer to localized temporal anomalies and spatial rifts that leave permanent marks on the landscape. The 60-second theory concerns the relationship between Arceus and Mew, and it is a particularly chewy problem of Pokemon cosmology. Arceus is described as the original being who created the universe. Mew is described as the ancestor of all Pokemon, from whose genetic material all other species descended. Both of these cannot be straightforwardly true at the same time without some explanation of how they fit together. The theory that reconciles them most elegantly is that Arceus created the universe's structure, its physical laws, its spatial and temporal framework, but did not create life directly. What Arceus created, among other things, was Mew. And Mew, over vast stretches of time, developed the biological diversity that eventually produced the thousands of Pokemon species that exist today. Arceus is the architect. Mew is the seed. The universe is the product of both, nested inside each other in a way that makes neither story false. The 63rd theory is about the Hall of Origin, the unreachable location where Arceus can be found in the Generation 4 games. It was only accessible through an official event distribution that was never released in most countries, meaning the vast majority of players never encountered it through legitimate gameplay. The theory built around this inaccessibility is that it was intentional from a narrative standpoint, that the developers wanted the Hall of Origin to feel genuinely unreachable, because the idea that a 10-year-old with a Pokeball could simply walk up to God and start a battle was, from a world-building perspective, somewhat awkward. The Hall is there in the code, it exists, but the path to it was withheld. And the theory suggests that this withholding was not logistical, but theological, a deliberate choice to keep the game's creator God at a respectful distance from the world it created. The 64th theory concerns what the Pokemon creation myth implies about the value of conflict. Arceus creates Dialga and Palkia, beings who eventually come into a terrible conflict. It creates Giratina, a being it then banishes. It creates the Lake Guardians, who in the game's plot are kidnapped and used against their will. Everything that Arceus makes eventually suffers. The theory reads this not as careless world building, but as the game's quiet statement about the nature of creation itself, that to make something is to make something that can be hurt, that the act of bringing life and consciousness into being carries with it the inevitable arrival of grief and conflict and loss. Arceus is not an absent or indifferent god. It is a creator who understood what it was doing and did it anyway, because a world capable of joy must also be capable of sorrow, and the one cannot exist without the other. Section 9, What the Developers Left Behind. There's a version of the Pokemon universe that never fully made it into the games, a shadow version constructed from cut content and unused code and developer interviews. And the theorists who have spent time in that shadow have found some remarkable things. The 65th theory concerns the original plan for Pokemon Gold and Silver, and specifically the version of Johto that might have existed. Developer interviews conducted years after the game's release reveal that the design of the second generation was far more ambitious than what shipped, with features cut due to memory limitations that, had they been included, would have made the games substantially different. The internal clock system, which is one of the defining features of the Johto games, was nearly removed multiple times because storing the palette data for day and night cycles across all of Johto's maps was eating too much of the Game Boy Color's limited memory. The theory is that the version of the games we received is a dramatically pared back vision of something more expansive, and that the sense of richness and depth that the Johto games have always carried in the fandom's memory is partly the richness of what we were told was there combined with the richness of what the code suggests was planned but never delivered. The 66th theory is about the berry system in Ruby and Sapphire and the small tragedy encoded in its real-time mechanics. Berries grew on bushes across the Hoenn region in real time, tied to the internal clock of the Game Boy Advance cartridge. If you planted a berry and came back in the right number of real-world hours, it would be grown and waiting for you. But the Game Boy Advance stored its internal clock on a small battery inside the cartridge, and when that battery died, which it inevitably did after a few years, the time-sensitive systems in the game stopped functioning. Berries stopped growing. The fields remained static and bare. The theory built around this is about the specific kind of grief produced by a dead battery. You come back to a game you loved, and the living world inside it has stopped. Not violently, not dramatically, but quietly. The flowers do not grow. The seasons do not change. The theory reads this as a metaphor for the way we return to things we loved in childhood and find them changed in ways that are difficult to articulate. The particular sadness of finding that something you remember as alive is now still. The 67th theory concerns N's room in Pokémon Black and White. After confronting the player at the end of the game, N is revealed to have lived in a castle that rises from the ground adjacent to the Pokémon League. Inside that castle, in a room near the top, is what appears to be a child's bedroom. Toys are scattered across the floor. A basketball hoop sits in one corner. There is a merry-go-round. The room is enormous, far too large for a bedroom, because it was the only space Getsus allowed N to occupy. The theory reads this room not as backstory, but as evidence of a specific kind of psychological imprisonment. N was given space. He was given toys. He was not given the world. And the oversized toy box quality of the room, combined with the eerie ambient music that plays inside it, creates an image of a man who grew up physically contained within a space designed to mimic childhood without allowing for the development that childhood is supposed to enable. The scratches on the toys suggest an animal, not a child, played with them. The 68th theory concerns the move Focus Energy in the original Pokémon Red and Blue, and what its existence reveals about the limitations of what we remember versus what was true. Focus Energy was designed to increase the critical hit rate of the Pokémon using it. It did the opposite. A single misplaced bit in the code inverted the effect, and for the entire duration of the first generation of games, every player who used Focus Energy was unknowingly making their Pokémon less effective in battle. The theory is not about the bug itself, which is documented and confirmed. The theory is about the fandom's memory of it. Players who used Focus Energy and lost battles they should have won attributed those losses to other causes. They blamed their strategy, their team, their opponent's luck. The actual cause, the silent misfire in the code, was invisible. And the theory proposes that this is a model for how the Pokemon games have always worked at their most interesting level, that there are systems operating underneath the surface that players interact with constantly without knowing they are doing so, and that our experience of the games is always partly the experience of something we do not fully understand. The 69th theory concerns the item sprites in the original games, and specifically the presence of certain item names and descriptions that correspond to mechanics that were never fully implemented. Text strings in the game's code reference systems for item combination, for environmental interaction, and for weather effects that have no corresponding functional code. The theory builds from this into a broader picture of how the first generation of games was developed under severe time pressure and with limited memory, and proposes that the version of Pokemon Red and Blue that exists is essentially the prototype of something much more ambitious, a game that was being designed as it was being finished, with features being stripped away in real time as deadlines approached and memory limits were hit. The 70th theory concerns the Pokemon fusion concept that was reportedly considered in early development and subsequently abandoned. The idea, as described in various developer accounts, was to allow players to combine two Pokemon into a single hybrid creature. The concept was scrapped because Game Freak felt it undermined the individuality of each species, which was considered central to the franchise's appeal. The theory built around this is about what it would have meant for the Pokemon world if it had existed. A world where two creatures can be permanently fused into a new single entity raises profound questions about identity and consent that the games, in their current form, never have to address. The fused Pokemon is neither of the original creatures. It is both and neither. The theory proposes that the concept was abandoned not just for gameplay reasons, but because thinking about it seriously leads to territory that a children's game was not equipped to handle. The 71st theory is about the Unknown and their relationship to the original legends of Sinnoh. In development notes for Gold and Silver, the Unknown were originally meant to have more direct ties to Arceus, the creator deity that was not introduced officially until Generation 4. The theory proposes that the Unknown were conceived as the written language of God, the letters through which Arceus communicated the structure of the universe into being, and that their placement in the ruins of Alphen Johto was meant to hint at this origin in ways that the developers felt were too cryptic for a general audience. When Arceus was finally introduced fully in Diamond and Pearl, the connection to Unknown was never made explicit, and the theory reads this as a regret, a piece of cosmic architecture that was built into the franchise's early games and then quietly orphaned by the later lore, never connected to what it was always meant to support. The 72nd theory concerns the player character's father in the games, and specifically the way that fathers are handled across generations. In Red and Blue, Red's father is not mentioned. In Gold and Silver, Professor Elm will mention that fathers are often absent because they are usually Pokemon trainers themselves, a piece of world building that acknowledges the pattern without explaining it. In Ruby and Sapphire, for the first time in the main series, the player's father is present in the game world as Norman, the gym leader of Petalburg City. The theory reads this progression as the franchise gradually working through its own relationship with paternal absence, moving from simple omission in Generation 1 to acknowledged mystery in Generation 2, to eventually a father who is present, but who the player must defeat in battle to progress. The theory proposes that the act of fighting and defeating Norman is not simply a game mechanic, but the franchise's most direct engagement with the psychological pattern of needing to surpass your parents to become yourself. Section 10. The theories that might just be true. There are theories in the Pokemon fandom that have never been confirmed by Game Freak, never officially acknowledged or denied, but which are so structurally coherent, so deeply supported by the available evidence, that dismissing them requires actively ignoring things that the games appear to be saying. This final section is for those theories, the ones that feel less like speculation and more like reading. The 73rd theory is about the silence of Trainer Red on Mount Silver in Gold and Silver. When the player climbs to the peak of Mount Silver after collecting 16 gym badges, they find Trainer Red waiting there. He does not speak. He does not announce himself. He simply stands in the cold, and when the battle is over, he disappears. Every other trainer in the games speaks. The gym leaders speak. The Elite Four speaks. The rivals speak. Red is the only trainer in the game who simply does not. The theory about this silence is not that it is a technical limitation or a stylistic choice by the developers, though it may be both. The theory is that Red has been alone on that mountain for years, training in isolation, and that the isolation has changed him. There is no one to talk to on Mount Silver. The snow falls and the cold increases, and the only company he has is his Pokémon. When someone finally climbs to meet him, he does not know how to respond with language anymore. He responds the only way he still knows. He battles. His silence is not emptiness. It is what happens to someone who has spent long enough in the cold without human contact. The 74th theory concerns why Red is on the mountain at all. The most deeply developed version of this theory, proposed across multiple forums and expanded over years, suggests that Red went to Mount Silver searching for Mew. At the end of Pokémon Red and Blue, the player has defeated Giovanni, dismantled Team Rocket, conquered the Elite Four, and captured or seen virtually every Pokémon in the world. The one remaining entry in the Pokédex, the one creature the game presents as mythical and unreachable, is Mew. And the theory says that Red could not let that go. He left Pallet Town not in triumph, but in pursuit, heading for the one creature that remained beyond him. He found Mount Silver. He found that Mew was not there. And then the blizzard came, or the cold came, or simply the years came, and Red stayed because leaving felt like admitting defeat. And Red is not someone who knows how to do that. The 75th theory is about the professors and their tree-based names. And it is one of those theories that technically has a mundane explanation, but which the fandom has enriched into something more interesting. The surface-level answer is that the professors are named after trees because it is a consistent world-building tradition, and because tree names are unlikely to overlap with player-chosen names. But the theory goes further and notes that each professor's specific tree carries specific symbolic weight. Oak is a tree of endurance and wisdom, associated in many cultures with patience and long life. Elm is a tree associated with intuition and inner sight. And Professor Elm is notable for his research into Pokémon breeding, the generative mystery of how species reproduce and pass on traits. Birch is associated with new beginnings, with the first tree to grow after a forest fire. And Professor Birch is the most field-oriented of the professors, the one you find running in the grass when his daughter first approaches you. The theory reads the tree names not as arbitrary tradition, but as a hidden taxonomy of values, each professor embodying the characteristics of the tree that carries their name. The 76th theory is about Giovanni and the strange fact that he was a gym leader. Giovanni runs Team Rocket. He is the most powerful criminal in the Pokémon world. And he is also in charge of the Viridian City Gym, the 8th and final gym of the Kanto region, the one the player must defeat last before challenging the Elite Four. The theory builds from this coincidence into something more deliberate. By controlling the last gym, Giovanni controlled the final gate between ordinary trainers in the Pokémon League. Every trainer who was strong enough to defeat him was, by definition, a trainer strong enough to challenge the Elite Four. And every trainer who challenged the Elite Four was someone of significant skill. The theory proposes that Giovanni used the gym not as a genuine demonstration of his Pokémon training philosophy, but as a talent scouting system, using the gym challenge as a filter to identify the most gifted trainers in Kanto. and that Team Rocket's operations included a quiet program of recruitment directed at the most promising young trainers who made it to his door. The 77th theory concerns the Pokemon's ability to feel their trainer's emotional state, which is documented in various Pokedex entries, in the friendship mechanic, and in the anime's frequent depictions of Pokemon responding to their trainer's mood. The theory builds from this into a question about what it means to train a Pokemon through battles. Every battle involves pain. Pokemon are hurt in battles. And if they can feel their trainer's emotions, then a trainer who fights with a calm and composed mindset is inflicting pain on a creature that can simultaneously feel their equanimity. The theory asks whether this emotional asymmetry, the trainer calm and focused, while the Pokemon suffers physical harm, is the specific dynamic that creates the bond of trust. That a Pokemon which experiences pain while surrounded by its trainer's care learns to associate that trainer's emotional presence with safety rather than threat. It is a theory about how love sometimes develops in the context of difficulty and what that means for both parties in the relationship. The 78th theory concerns the color palette of the Pokemon world and the specific visual language of the games. In the first generation, the world is rendered in stark blues and reds, in the black and white of Game Boy screens overlaid with the primary colors of the box art. In gold and silver, color was added, and the world became softer and more varied. In each subsequent generation, the visual palette has expanded and softened further. The theory reads this progression not simply as technological improvement, but as a narrative arc, that the world of Pokemon gets more colorful as it heals, that the stark, monochrome world of the original games is not just a hardware limitation, but a representation of a society still recovering from the war, still seeing the world in primary terms of conflict and survival, and that each subsequent game's richer visual world reflects the passage of time and the slow return of complexity and peace. The 79th theory is about the naming convention for the rival characters across generations, and what the pattern reveals about the franchise's evolving relationship with competition. Red's rival is blue. Silver is the rival in gold. Wally is the rival in ruby. Barry and Paul in diamond and pearl. And in black and white. Each generation's rival represents a different model of what it means to compete with someone. Blue is competitive in a dismissive way, treating Red as an obstacle to his own destiny. Silver is angry, treating trainers with contempt because he was raised to see Pokemon as tools. Barry is hyper-energetic and friendly. N is the most radical departure, a rival who is not trying to beat you but to change your worldview. The theory reads the rival characters as a narrative about how the franchise itself thinks about competition, moving from rivalry as adversarial and personal in the early games to rivalry as philosophical and ultimately collaborative, and proposes that the direction of this movement was intentional and reflects something the developers were consciously working through. The 80th theory concerns the way Pokemon evolve in the context of the game's story. Many Pokemon evolve through experience, through being in enough battles to reach a threshold of development. But some evolve through friendship. Some evolve through the use of elemental stones. Some evolve only during the day, and some only at night. Some evolve when holding specific items. Some evolve only when traded to another trainer. The theory proposes that this diversity in evolution mechanisms is not just gameplay variety, it is the game's encoding of multiple theories of personal growth. Some things you become by doing a lot of hard things. Some things you become only when someone truly loves you. Some things you become only in the presence of specific conditions, only at certain times, only when you are given to someone else and they give you back. Each evolution type is a different answer to the question of how living things change. And the franchise contains all of them because the answer to that question is genuinely different for every creature asking it. The 81st theory concerns the specific design of Pokemon centers and their presence in every town, and what this implies about the value placed on healing in the Pokemon world. No matter where you are in any Pokemon game, there is a place to heal. Some towns have nothing else except a Pokemon Center. No shops, no residents of interest, just a building full of pink decoration and soft music where your Pokemon are returned to full health for free. The theory builds from this into a statement about the values of the Pokemon world, that whatever else is uncertain, whatever else may be contested or competed over, the healing of injured creatures is treated as an unconditional social good. No one charges for it. No one restricts access to it. It is simply there, everywhere, always available because the world has collectively decided that this specific form of care should not be conditional on anything. The theory reads this as the franchise's most radical political statement, delivered so quietly and so consistently that most players never notice they have been told something about how a society could choose to organize itself. The 82nd theory is about the Pokemon world's relationship to memory. In Gold and Silver, the time capsule allows players to trade Pokemon back to Red and Blue, moving creatures from the present to the past and back again. In later games, the Pokemon Bank and eventually Pokemon Home create systems for holding Pokemon across multiple generations, across multiple hardware platforms, across decades of playing. The theory reads these systems not as convenience features, but as statements about what is worth preserving. A Pokemon you raised in a game 20 years ago carries with it the experience of being raised by a younger version of yourself. The theory proposes that the Pokemon in these storage systems are not simply data. They are memories that have been given a body, a form that can be moved from cartridge to cartridge as hardware changes and games update, carrying with them the invisible record of every battle and every mile walked, and every moment spent together with a child who is now an adult, sitting quietly in the dark. The 83rd theory concerns why Pokemon do not appear to age significantly in the games, despite existing in a world with time passing. The friendship mechanic shows that bonds develop over time, but a Charizard you catch at level 36 and a Charizard you raise from a Charmander appear identical in all functional respects. The theory proposes that Pokemon do age but slowly in ways the games do not model, because their lifespans operate on timescales that human lives cannot encompass. Pokemon in this reading are not merely powerful animals. They are ancient by any measure that matters to a human being. And the 10-year-old trainer who catches a Gengar is entering a relationship with something that has been in this world for longer than any human alive can remember. The friendship they develop is not between peers. It is between the very old and the very young, and the wisdom that passes between them moves in both directions. The 84th theory concerns the design of the Pokeball itself. Round, compact, red on the top and white on the bottom. Colors associated in many cultures with the sky and earth, with the above and below, with the visible world and whatever lies beneath it. The button in the center is the point of contact, the meeting place between the world inside and the world outside. The theory reads the Pokeball as a deliberate cosmological symbol, the universe as Arceus created it encoded into a single tool, with the red upper half representing the realm of living Pokemon and the human world, and the white lower half representing the realm within the ball, the interior space that is somehow dimensionally large enough to contain a creature at rest. A space that has never been fully described in official materials, but which the games have always implied is something other than a simple container. The 85th theory is about the music of the entire franchise and what it reveals about the emotional architecture of the games. The Pokemon games are full of music that is simultaneously cheerful and melancholic, upbeat and tinged with something wistful. The battle themes are exciting, But many of the town themes carry a particular ache, especially the later ones, the ones for Lavender Town and Ecruteak City and Celestic Town, which are among the oldest places in their respective regions. The theory proposes that this musical tension is not accidental, but is the game's primary emotional communication. The way they tell you without words that the world you are traveling through is both wonderful and fragile, that the adventure is happening in a place with a long and complicated history, and that the cheerfulness of the surface does not fully contain the depth of what lies underneath it. The 86 theory concerns what Red's team composition in gold and silver reveals about his mental state. When the player encounters Red on Mount Silver, he has a Pikachu, an Espeon, a Snorlax, a Venusaur, a Charizard, and a Blastoise, all three original starters. The theory about this team is that Red, isolated on the mountain and cut off from ordinary Pokemon training contexts, has curated the team that means the most to him personally, rather than the team that would be most strategically optimal. He has all three starters because they represent the beginning of the adventure, the moment when the choice of who to become was first offered. He has Pikachu because it was his first companion and remains his truest one. And he has Espeon, which evolves through friendship during the daytime, because somewhere in the years of solitude, Red developed a relationship with a creature built entirely on trust and care. The team is not optimized for battle. It is a portrait of a person. Section 10.5. The theories the internet never let go. Between the careful structural theories and the philosophical ones, there is a layer of Pokemon conspiracy that lives specifically on forums and comment sections, in the margins of wikis and the bodies of decade-old YouTube videos. These are the theories that never got officially confirmed, never got officially denied, and simply kept circulating because something about their shape was too satisfying to release. The theory about the truck in Vermilion City is worth dwelling on precisely because it is not true. In the original Red and Blue near the SS Annie Harbor, there was a parked truck beside a cluster of water roots. The truck could not be moved. It served no purpose. And within months of the game's release, a playground rumor had spread across every country where the games were sold. Mew was hiding under the truck. If you had a specific Pokemon, if you pressed a specific button sequence, if you had beaten the Elite Four a specific number of times, the truck would move and Mew would be there. None of this was true. The theory built around this collective false memory is not about the truck itself, but about what the truck represented. In 1996 and 1997, with no reliable way to share game information globally, rumors traveled at the speed of handwriting through schoolyard whispers and letters, and photocopied notes passed between friends. The Mew under the truck was not a theory, it was a faith position. It was held because the world of Pokemon seemed so full of secrets that, of course, there was something under that truck, and the absence of evidence was not evidence of absence. The theory about the theory is that the truck rumor tells us more about how children process wonder than it tells us anything about Pokemon, and the game's eventual winking acknowledgement of the legend in Sun and Moon, where a parked truck appears near a harbor with no function and no explanation. Was the developers recognizing that the mythology their players built was as much a part of the franchise's history as anything they deliberately designed? The theory about Kadabra and real-world history is one of the stranger documented stories saw in the franchise. A lawsuit from a public figure claiming Kadabra was based on him without permission resulted in the card being largely absent from the trading card game for over a decade, not printed on new cards from roughly 2003 to 2020. The surrounding theory is not about the lawsuit itself, but about what Kadabra's Pokedex entry says in light of it. The entry describes a child who woke up one morning having transformed into a Kadabra overnight. The theory reads this as the game describing, in the language of its fiction, the same kind of unwilling transformation that the lawsuit claimed to represent. becoming the thing that defines you without choosing to be it, having your identity assigned by something external, existing in a form that carries someone else's interpretation of your nature. The theory about Misty's bicycle operates at the level of series structure. Ash borrows Misty's bicycle in the first episode and destroys it. For most of the original series, Misty follows Ash partly to recover compensation for the bicycle. It becomes a running joke. The theory is that the bicycle is deliberately never replaced because the moment it is resolved, the narrative justification for Misty's continued presence is removed. She stays because of an unresolved debt. The debt stays unresolved because she needs to stay. When Misty eventually leaves the series, the bicycle is quietly acknowledged in her final episode. The debt is settled at the moment of departure, which in narrative terms is exactly when it should be. Section 11. The deeper threads. The theories do not stop at 100, of course. The Pokémon universe is large enough that theorists have been finding new threads to pull for 30 years, and every new game adds more material to work with. But there are some deeper connective threads that run through everything discussed here. Patterns that emerge when you hold all the theories at once. The 87 theory concerns the consistent absence of death in the games as something that is constantly discussed without being shown. Pokémon in the games do not die in battle. They faint. The Pokémon centers exist to restore them, and yet the Pokédex is full of death. The games reference death constantly through their lore, their ghost stories, their dark character histories, and the tragedy of their side characters. The theory proposes that this gap between the game's mechanics and the game's world is the single most important artistic choice the franchise ever made. By keeping death out of the gameplay while keeping it present in the story, the games create a specific emotional state. You are always safe to play, but you are never fully permitted to forget that the world inside the game contains the same irreversible losses as the world outside it. The 88 theory concerns what the Pokémon franchise says about the specific generation of children who grew up with it in the 90s. Those children were born into a world that was just beginning to process a series of enormous losses. The end of the Cold War, the acceleration of globalization, the dawning awareness of environmental destruction on a planetary scale. Pokémon offered them a world in which a child could matter, in which the natural world was full of wonder rather than danger, in which friendship and determination were adequate tools for addressing any problem. The theory reads the franchise not as escapism, but as equipment, a set of emotional tools and frameworks given to a generation that needed them, encoded in the shape of small, colorful creatures and adventures that never had to end. The 89th theory concerns the way that Pokémon has handled the concept of evolution, which is the franchise's central mechanic and also its most philosophically loaded one. In the real world, evolution is a slow, blind process driven by environmental pressure over vast spans of time. In the Pokémon world, evolution is dramatic and immediate. It happens in front of you as the result of specific triggering conditions, and it produces a visibly different and more powerful creature. The theory proposes that the Pokémon conception of evolution is not a misunderstanding of the scientific one, but a deliberate emotional reframing of it, a version of transformation that is comprehensible to a child, that is tied to relationships and effort and specific conditions, rather than to geological time and a random mutation, and which encodes the idea that becoming something new is not an accident, but a response to something. The 90th theory is about what happens to the Pokémon that you release. The game allows you to open the storage boxes and release any Pokémon you have caught. It returns to the wild. The game says nothing further, but the theory built around released Pokémon is about what they carry with them. A Pokémon that has been caught trained, bonded with a trainer, and then released, has a set of experiences and capabilities that no wild Pokemon of its species would normally have. It goes back to the wilderness carrying the traces of a relationship with a human. Trained moves that its natural cousins do not know. A set of experiences that mark it as different from everything around it. The theory reads release Pokemon as a kind of cultural transfer, human knowledge and human feeling dispersed into the natural world. The boundary between the wild and the trained made permanently permeable by the act of letting something go. The 91st theory concerns the Pokemon that travel with you in your party versus the ones you keep in storage. You can have 6 with you and as many hundreds in boxes. The Pokemon in the boxes are not inactive, not entirely. They exist somewhere, maintained by a system that the games describe but never fully explain. Waiting. The theory about this is gently unsettling and also warm. The Pokemon in the boxes are in some kind of suspension, but they remember the trainer who caught them. They are, in some meaningful sense, waiting to be chosen. And the theory proposes that the reason players often feel guilt about leaving Pokemon in boxes is not irrational sentiment, but an accurate read of what the game's lore implies. Those creatures have been given to your care, and leaving them untouched for years is a kind of neglect that the mechanics never punish, but which the lore never excuses. The 90-second theory concerns the concept of a Nuzlocke run, the fan-created challenge mode in which any Pokemon that faints is considered permanently dead and must be released or boxed forever. This is not an official mode. It was created by a player and spread through the community until it became one of the most popular ways to play the games. The theory about the Nuzlocke is that it exists because the official games, by protecting the player from permanent loss, have always left something missing. The Nuzlocke fills that absence by importing mortality back into the mechanics, creating a version of the game where the things you lose stay lost, where the bonds you form carry genuine stakes, and where the journey ends with grief that cannot be healed in a Pokemon Center. The theory proposes that the Nuzlocke's popularity is not a rejection of what the games was, but an addition to it. A community-generated response to the emotional gap between the franchise's stated themes of friendship and loss, and the mechanics that protect you from experiencing loss fully. The 93rd theory is about the post-game in every Pokemon title, the content that exists after the main narrative has concluded, the events and areas and challenges that are accessible only after the credits have rolled. The theory reads the post-game not as bonus content, but as the game's actual ending. The story ends when the credits roll, but the world does not. The world continues, and in it are things the story never addressed. Longer routes, deeper caves, stronger trainers, creatures that never appeared in the main narrative at all. The postgame is the franchise's way of saying that the world is larger than the story told about it. That completion is not the same as understanding, and that the most interesting places are often the ones you can only reach after you have done everything the narrative required of you. The 94th theory concerns the design philosophy behind each region's villain team. Team Rocket wants money and power. Team Magma and Team Aqua want to change the physical world through the expansion of land or sea. Team Galactic wants to destroy the universe and create a new one without spirit. Team Plasma wants to liberate Pokemon from humanity. Team Flare wants to eliminate most of humanity to preserve what remains of the beautiful world. Each villain team, the theory observes, represents a different kind of catastrophizing response to genuine problems in the real world. Poverty and inequality, environmentalism, nihilism, animal rights, sustainability, and population. The theory reads the villain teams not as random antagonists, but as a catalog of the ways us that legitimate grievances can curdle into extremism when stripped of empathy, and proposes that the games have always been, at their most honest, about the question of what to do with justified anger. The 95th theory concerns the role of the player character across all the games and the specific quality that each player character shares. They are almost entirely silent. They have names and appearances that the player chooses or accepts, but they rarely speak. Their inner lives are not described. And the theory about this silence is not that the player characters are empty vessels for projection, though they are designed to be. The theory is that the silence is the point. In a series so concerned with the bonds between creatures, the player character's silence is the most direct statement the games make about the nature of connection. You do not need to speak to form a bond. You do not need to narrate your feelings for them to be real. The player character's silence is not the absence of a self. It is the radical presence of one, expressed entirely through choices and movements, and who you choose to travel with. The 96th theory is about what happens when a trainer and their Pokémon have been together for a very long time. The friendship mechanics show Pokémon becoming closer to their trainers over time, but these mechanics have a ceiling. They max out. The theory proposes that beyond the ceiling, beyond what the mechanics can model, something else happens. Something that the games can only gesture toward in specific moments. The Pikachu that refuses to evolve. The Butterfree that stays by the shore long after the separation. The Pokémon that somehow find their trainers across impossible distances in the anime. The theory calls this something loyalty beyond measure, a quality that exists in the Pokémon world, but which the systems of the games have never been able to fully contain. The 97th theory circles all the way back to the beginning, to the Pokédex project and what it is really for. The theory states that the Pokédex was never primarily a scientific instrument. It was always a way for one generation to pass knowledge to the next. The old men in Kanto who warn you about danger around every corner. The gym leaders who seem relieved when a young trainer arrives and proves themselves. The professors who hand over this device with such evident care. They are not trying to build a database. They are trying to make sure that what they know, what they have seen and survived, does not disappear with them. The Pokédex project is an act of love across time. An older generation handing a younger generation the tools to understand the world they are inheriting. The 98th theory concerns the specific relationship between the player and the games themselves, and it is the most meta theory in this entire list. When you play a Pokémon game, you make choices that the game remembers. The starter you chose, the nicknames you gave, the team you built, the rival you defeated. And when you come back to that save file years later, the game has kept all of it exactly as you left it. The theory is that the games are the most reliable archivists of specific emotional moments that most people have ever encountered. A memory of choosing Charmander at age 8 is preserved in a save file with more fidelity than the memory itself. The theory reads this as the game's most profound gift. Not the adventure, not the creatures, not the battles, but the preservation of who you were when you played them. The proof that the small person you were then existed and chose things and built something, and that those choices and that building are still there, waiting for you in a cartridge on a shelf somewhere. The 99th theory is about the name Pokémon and what it carries in Japanese. The original term is pocket monsters, and the choice of that name was deliberate. Pocket, because they fit in a device you carry. Monsters, because they are strange and powerful and not entirely understood. But the theory notes that monster is a word with roots in the Latin monstrare, meaning to show or to display, and from monstrum, meaning an omen or portent. A monster is not simply a frightening thing, it is a revealing thing, a thing that shows something true about the world by its very existence. The theory reads every Pokemon as a small portent, each one showing something about the natural world, about emotion, about history, about the specific fears and wonders of the culture that made them. They are pocket-sized omens, carried everywhere, showing you the world one small truth at a time. The 99th and a half theory, if you will allow the indulgence, concerns the very specific emotional experience of returning to a Pokemon game after a long absence and what the game does to you in those first few moments of reloading a save file you have not touched in years. The music starts. The familiar theme rises. The world appears exactly as you left it. Your character stands in a room or on a route or in a cave, exactly where you were when you last saved, frozen in place for however long you were away, years sometimes. The theory proposes that this specific moment of return is unlike almost any other experience that media can create, because it is not simply a return to a fictional world, but a return to a version of yourself. The save file holds the choices of whoever you were when you played this last, the team you assembled, the towns you visited, the way you named things. Those names especially. There is no more direct record of childhood unself-consciousness than the nicknames a child gave to creatures in a video game. The theory says that reading those names back to yourself as an adult is a form of archaeology, that you are excavating yourself, turning over the layers of who you have been to reach what you originally were. And the games allow this. They keep the record. They wait. A Charizard named Blazer in all caps by an 8-year-old is still named Blazer when a 30-year-old picks up the cartridge in a quiet room. The 8-year-old is gone. The name is not. The theory extending from this is about what it means that so many people carry these specific emotional memories in the specific form of a Pokemon game. There's a generation of adults now, scattered across every corner of the world, who have in common the experience of a specific kind of wonder. A kind of wonder that was generated by small, bright creatures and simple music and a world that felt simultaneously familiar and endlessly surprising. They do not all know each other. They do not all speak the same language. They have different backgrounds and different histories and different relationships to the franchise now. Some still deeply invested, and some long since moved on to other things. But they share the memory. And the theory is that this shared memory is itself something new in human history. A collective emotional landmark created not by a historical event or a cultural tradition passed down through generations, but by a children's game. And that the communities and conversations and theories and creative works it has generated are a kind of culture, self-made and ongoing, that the people who made the game almost certainly did not predict and could not have fully intended. You cannot set out to create a mythology. You can only make something with enough depth and care that other people decide to live in it, and then the mythology grows by itself, in the space between what was made and what was imagined. The 100th theory is the simplest and the last. It is this. The Pokemon franchise has lasted as long as it has meant as much as it has, to as many people as it has, not because of the gameplay mechanics or the creature designs or the trading card values or the cultural visibility. It has lasted because it told a generation of children something that most children are not told directly enough, that the natural world is full of wonders you have not yet discovered, that the bonds you form with other living things are the most important work you will ever do, that the journey matters more than the destination, and that even when you lose, even when the thing you were holding slips away from you, the act of having held it was real, and it changed you, and the change does not disappear when the holding ends. That is the theory underneath all the other theories. That Pokemon, for all its hidden darkness and all its quiet grief, and all its coded history and all its mysterious gaps was made by people who believed in something. And the something they believed in was small and yellow and sat on a child's shoulder and refused to evolve because it was already exactly where it wanted to be. These 100 theories do not exhaust the Pokemon universe. They barely scratch the surface. There are theories about the origins of specific moves, about the true history of the Weather Trio in Hoenn, about what the Distortion world looked like before Giratina was banished there, about whether the player in Black and White is the same as the one in Black 2 and White 2 and what happened to them in between, about whether Red and Leaf are the same person or two separate canons running in parallel, about whether Giovanni truly gave up after the events of Red and Blue, or whether he simply changed his methods. The threads keep going. That is the nature of a universe this richly detailed and this deliberately ambiguous. It was designed to reward looking closely. It was designed to reward coming back. It was designed to grow with you. So wherever you are right now, whatever time it is, however far you have traveled from the child who first held a Game Boy or sat in front of a television watching Ash run across a field, chasing something golden and vanishing, these theories are here for you. Quiet and slow and full of everything you might have missed. Sleep well. The journey continues tomorrow. If any of these theories kept your mind turning tonight, or if you have one of your own that deserves a place on this list, drop it in the comments. And if you made it all the way here through every theory and every quiet thought and every long stretch of lore, consider leaving a like and subscribing to Unclick You on Poke. There's more to come. More theories, more lore, more nights exactly like this one. The channel stays lit as long as you keep the light on with us. Rest well. A final word. The one thing that binds all of these theories together, across 100 different angles and 100 different corners of the franchise, is the same thing that binds the games themselves together, across 30 years of releases. Attention. Someone paid attention. The theorists who built these ideas paid attention to things that the games and the anime did not explain. They sat with the silences and asked what was in them. They noticed the truck that served no purpose and imagined something under it. They counted the missing fathers and drew a line between them. They heard a piece of music and asked why it made them feel the way it did. They looked at a small purple blob and wondered why it weighed the same as a mythical creature and could use the same move and lived in the same places. The games reward attention. They always have. The franchise was built by a man who paid attention to insects, to the specific weight and texture and movement of small creatures and fields, to the way that careful observation reveals a kind of richness in the natural world that casual looking misses entirely. Satoshi Tajiri made Pokemon because he could not stop paying attention to the world around him, and the world he made reflects that compulsion. Every theory in this list is, at its root, an act of paying attention in the same spirit that made the games worth paying attention to in the first place. So if you have reached the end of this list and found yourself still awake, still turning ideas over in the comfortable dark, still wondering about the war that left Kanto so empty of fathers, still thinking about a boy asleep in a hospital, somewhere dreaming of a golden bird, still sitting with the image of a small creature holding its own face and crying in a world that does not have a name for what it is, that is not an accident. That is what it feels like when something was made with enough depth to actually reach you. And the fact that it can still reach you after all the years and all the changes is the only theory about Pokemon that has never needed any evidence at all. There is one more thing worth saying before the night closes. The Pokemon universe, for all the darkness that these theories have uncovered or constructed, is not fundamentally a dark place. It is a place that takes darkness seriously. There is a difference. A franchise that takes darkness seriously does not hide it behind cheerful music and colorful design and then pretend it is not there. It encodes it, it layers it, it places it in the smallest text boxes of the most obscure Pokédex entries, in the dialogue of gym leaders who survived things that should have killed them, in the structural absences of a world that is missing its fathers and its explanations. It trusts that the people who play its games are capable of holding complexity, of noticing sorrow inside wonder, of understanding that something can be bright and beautiful at the surface and heavy and honest underneath. Pokemon has always trusted its audience with this, and the audience, generation after generation, has proved worthy of that trust by building exactly the kind of rich, attentive, emotionally literate body of thought that these 100 theories represent. The franchise made the space. The community filled it. That partnership is its own theory about what the best creative works do. They do not give you everything. They give you enough to start from, and then they leave room for you to become a co-creator of the meaning. Rest now. The Pokemon are in their boxes. The music has slowed down to almost nothing. Wherever you are, whatever brought you here tonight, the journey continues tomorrow. The quiet has settled in now. The theories have found their place. 100 small lights in the dark, each one the shape of a question that someone cared enough to ask and careful enough to answer, even without the official confirmation that never came. Sleep with these. Let them settle into whatever space your mind holds for the things it cannot fully resolve. The unresolved is not a problem. In the world of Pokemon, the unresolved is half of everything. The unanswered cry of a creature you have not yet named. The blank square in the Pokédex where something extraordinary is waiting to be found. The summit of a cold mountain where someone is standing in the snow, saying nothing, carrying everything. The world of Pokemon has always been as large as the attention you bring to it. No more and no less. Tonight you brought a great deal of attention. That means the world, at least this version of it, was very large indeed.